Hi, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. My name is Nydia, and thank you, Aman, for the kind introduction earlier. So I am your moderator for today's panel, Going Global, Cellular Agriculture Across the Region. So I think everybody that are interested in this sector has been seeing a lot of momentum built up over the years, and especially last year and this year, coming from the cellular sector. And I think today is, I'm super excited to be here so we can actually pick brains on some of the experts in different regions that's really focusing on the cultivated meat development of their in their space. So without further ado, I am gonna let every panelist do an introduction of themselves. And then if they have slides to share, please feel free to volunteer. Nir, do you want to start first?
Yes, thank you. What an honor. And I want to join you in thanking Ahmed for this wonderful event and putting together this exciting panel. So my name is Nir Goldstein. I'm the Managing Director of the Good Food Institute in Israel. If you don't know GFI and you're interested in alternative protein, I suggest you go to our website, either the global one at gfi.org or the Israeli one, which you can see in my name tag. In general, GFI is an international non-profit organization. We are working to make sure that alternative proteins are no longer alternative. We are doing so by working with three main audiences. One is the scientific and technology audience. We are financing research, publishing white papers, and just give a lot of consulting around the world. So that's one. Two is corporate engagement. We're working with the world's biggest food, agri, pharma, and manufacturing companies to make sure the strategy is aligned for this field, but also with investors, startups, entrepreneurs, etc. And the third field we are working on is policy. We're working with governments and multinational organizations around the world to make sure alternative proteins are on their agenda, whether it be regulation or investments in the field. We operate around the world, so we're main base in the United States, but besides that, we have people around the globe again. In Asia, we have locations in India, Singapore, and we have partnerships with an organization, GFIC, in mainland China. We are working in Brazil, in Europe, where we have organizations scattered around London and Brussels for now. And here in tiny Israel, which I have the honor to lead our efforts here. Israel is already known to be a global hub for alternative protein research and innovation. So just to give you a few numbers from our innovation report, which we published earlier this month, and you can download it for free on our website. We have about 50 startups in Israel working on alternative proteins, which make it a global hub. 3 of the first 8 cultivated meat startups come from Israel and are doing great. Companies like Supermeat, Aleph Farms, Future Meat, and are now joined by others like Meatech, which is already traded publicly on NASDAQ. We have the second largest hub of fermentation startups worldwide, with 9 of them. Companies like Milk, who are doing precision fermentation to create a new array of cheese products, etc. And of course, plant-based products. We have over 300 labs in Israel which are relevant for alternative protein research. And we have a supportive government with the Israel Innovation Authority funding and promoting the field. And I look forward to speak more about it at the panel. Thanks, Nydia.
Thank you, Nir. Natalie, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie. I am the program manager of Brink's Food Technology Accelerator programs. So we launched one of the first food tech focused accelerator programs in late 2018-19 and invests in any technology that helps make our food system more sustainable. So the bulk of our investments is in this alternative protein field. And just last year, we also launched a accelerator program in China focused specifically to help foster the ecosystem in China and invest in alt protein companies operating in China. We've now grown to about 32 investments, all double bottom impact, and we are very excited to be here. Likewise, thank you very much to Ahmed and the team for putting us together, and really looking forward to hearing perspectives globally on how the industry has grown this past year.
Thank you, Natalie. Tony, do you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Tony Hunter. I'm a food futurist based out of Brisbane, Australia. And my introduction to really getting into cell-based products in particular was the GFI conference in San Francisco in 2018. That was a real eye-opener to me, to just see what was going on in the food industry, because I've been in the food industry for a fair few years. And I've got to say, this is the most exciting time to be in the food industry I've seen in the 30+ years that I've been around. And certainly looking at technology coming into food, this is, you know, the golden age of technology for food. And I really think that food is now as much technology as anything else. It's the same technology as if we had the technology around mobile phones or electronics. We advance at exponential speed. I mean, you look at today, most of the meat, they've reduced in 2 years the cost of their media by a factor of 65 in 2 years. So I think we're going to make Moore's law look pretty sick in the next 4 or 5 years. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens. And obviously we've got some great people here with me on the panel to help us see where things are going and how they're going to turn out. And what I do is both I speak on the future of food. I used to do that overseas before the pandemic, but of course been a little bit limited since then. And also consult for companies both in Australia and globally. Luckily, with things like Zoom, I can still keep the consulting side of things going, and webinars for the speaking. So that's all been good. And just to give you a brief overview of where we are in Australia, I shall just share my screen now. And just to see, obviously a map of Australia there, and looking at the companies we've got in Australia at the moment. Now, we're certainly a few years behind the US, and I'm not even going to mention that powerhouse Israel that we look rather sick against as well. But we are catching up, and we have a few companies, and we have one over, we look at our academic institutions as well as the actual companies that are involved. We have quite a few universities in Australia that are now getting into the research side of things on cultivated meat. And we have some very, very good universities. Some of our universities are in the top 10 in the world. So we've got some really good academic qualifications, academic institutes. Getting that commercialized has been a problem for Australia, but we're getting a little bit better. And if we look there now at further in Western Australia, we have CAS Materials. And CAS Materials are looking at scaffoldings. So they use something in cocoa de nata, which is a natural material that can be used as a scaffolding, and they're developing that now. And then if we move across to my home state, to Brisbane, we have the University of the Sunshine Coast, and we have Nourish Ingredients, and they're doing animal-free fats and oils. And then we have Huros, who are doing growth factors. And if we move down now to Sydney, we've got Vow Foods, who are doing a lot of non-domesticated animals. They've done kangaroo meat down at Vow. So they're very much in the cultivated meat space, and they do everything at the moment, though, from their own media right through to growing the meat itself. We have the University of Sydney, one of the top 10 universities in the world, University of New South Wales as well, and of course, Food Frontiers, who are a sister organisation to GFI. And if we move down to Melbourne, we've got Change Foods, who are doing acellular dairy, so they're doing dairy products. Magic Valley, who are doing meat. Then we have Myanmar, who are right at the cutting edge of some of the cellular agriculture that we're seeing in doing breast milk. So that's a really interesting space that's opening up around the world now, is using cellular agriculture to grow mammary glands to grow milk from any species, including human. And that's what Myanmar are about. Then we have the University of Melbourne. And of course, we have Cellular Agriculture Australia based down in Melbourne as well. So that's really gives you an idea of what the ecosystem is like in Australia. Relatively small and not nearly as advanced. So we don't have anyone going to you know, Series B, even Series A funding over here. Most of it's in seed and startup, but coming in second in some cases is not always all bad, because you learn from some of the mistakes of the others. So I'd suggest that what we've done in the last couple of years probably took 5 years for those pioneers over in the US and Israel as well. So that's just a brief overview. Thank you, Nydia. I'll stop sharing and back to you.
Thank you, Tony. That's wonderful. Dalal, last but not least, please.
Thank you, Nydia. It's great to be with these amazing panelists today. So hi, everyone. I'm the Program Director for Big Idea Ventures Singapore. So Big Idea Ventures is a venture capital firm that's quite new to the scene. We were founded in March 2019. As a VC, of course, we're backed by very strategic partners, including Temasek, Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, Tyson Ventures, and many more. The list goes on and on. But definitely what we try to encompass and do is use our strategic partners to be able to support the world's most innovative alternative protein companies. So we're very laser focused. We focus only on sort of the plant-based or more of the biotech space solutions around, let's say, reducing animal agricultural products. So right now, of course, we have offices in New York, Singapore. We've just launched in Paris this year as well, and hopefully we'll be expanding into Greater China as well as India in the near future. So we're very excited to be a part of this ecosystem. Very excited to be based in Singapore, which is really showing to be the region's leading food tech hub. And that's all to do with sort of the government policies, as well as the openness for corporates to kind of come and, let's say, strategically operate, as well as grow out the local ecosystem, and at the same time, of course, attract international talent. So yeah, I'll kind of stop there because I'm sure everyone has some very interesting insights. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow, that is very, very comprehensive and great introductions coming from everybody. I think right now I'm gonna just start asking questions. I think first questions I'm gonna give it to Nir. So I've been hearing a lot about things, a lot about news and then imaginations and guesses about who will be the next commercialized market, for cultivated meat, since EGS is really paved the way for our expectation to really let the consumers have a taste of what a cultivated meat product will be. So in your opinion here, what do you, in the context of Israel, and then we're definitely want to hear more. So do you think Israel will be the next? And then if yes, and then we will also want to hear what other countries that you think are super interesting and that might be, be the second or third or the coming afterwards.
That's a very good question nowadays. I don't think anyone has a definite answer, but what I love seeing is that we are seeing a race, a global race, who will be the first, the second to allow the products to go to market. It influences not only the consumers, of course, who want to be able to get access to those products, but where will the industry of production of cultivated meat will be built, because companies are right now, as you mentioned before, are in the stages of finishing their startup building phase, and are now most developed startups are at the stage where they are building their pilot plants. And with food, the way food is, those plants need to be relatively close to the market where the products could be sold. So definitely a lot of excitement around Singapore, and I see more and more companies wanting to go to market in Singapore because they see that it's possible to sell products over there. With regards to what's going on in Israel, we are very actively working with the Israeli government on a regulatory pathway. It's not an easy task. It's not a matter of a few months, that's for sure. but I'm really hoping that by the end of 2022, we will be able to sell cultivated meat here in Israel as well. We have a few companies that are willing and wanting to go to market in Israel. Like Singapore, it's a small market, but it's a very good pilot market because of many different reasons. We also see the US in this race, and it's possible that they will be next. Also Japan, a few people are talking about Japan, Australia. So a few names are up there in the competition, which I really like. Having said that, I think we should make sure that the government's attention to the field shouldn't be limited only to regulation. We need to have more investment in open access research worldwide. We need to have more investment in infrastructure. We are changing, revolutionizing the way we produce meat worldwide, and we need governments to be focused not only on regulation.
Thank you. I totally agree. And I think the next question, I'm gonna give it to Natalie. So I agree with Nir. I think, you know, a victory for cultivating meat come from all aspects of, you know, the value chain. And then so as Spring, for your program, I know that you guys also has a quite international program as well. So I want to know more about what have you guys been working on in terms of this cultivating meat aspect of things.
Sure, happy to answer that. So I think as an accelerator program, we often tell our teams there are so many factors that are needed, like Nir mentioned, for any startup to succeed. It's not just the team themselves and their hard work, but it's the right regulatory framework, it's backing by investors, it's resources in terms of R&D labs, technical talent, it's mentorship, it's corporate innovation and big corporates that have the infrastructure to support innovation and collaboration. So part of our work as an accelerator is, especially in markets where they're still relatively nascent, is ecosystem building. You know, reaching out to partners in a lot of different fields, from universities to corporates to investors, to introduce, to build the foundation work to help early stage and growth stage startups succeed. So often when people ask us, okay, what do we actually do in an accelerator? First and foremost, I'd say an accelerator program, although it's only 3 months long or 6 months long or however long it is, it's very much the beginning of an engagement. It's a sprint where we work together very closely to deep dive on the current needs of the company, but actually at the beginning of the relationship, it's a relationship that continues to evolve, because what we're essentially doing is plugging them in to an ecosystem of players, all necessary to help the entire ecosystem grow. So I think the Chinese example is a good one. The cell ag landscape is still relatively nascent. There are only 3 cellular agriculture companies so far in China, 2 of which we've invested in. Avant Meats is a great example. I think Carrie and her team need no introduction. They just gave a speech early on today of how actually leveraging corporate partnerships can be key to success. Their strategic partnership with one of China's leading biotech firms shows how quickly they can reduce the costs and pace to market. Another one, Joe's Future Food, shows how important also government resources and nodding is. So Joe's Future Food is actually a company that's come out of a government-backed research project. And the last one, Celex, also another thing that's quite indicative of China's cell ag landscape is the speed and scale at which things can happen. And this is a team that started about a year ago, and in that they've raised $5 million in capital and expanded their team to 30 people. And that's the thing with, I think, the Chinese landscape. It's nascent, it's growing, but it has this incredible capacity to grow at such speed and scale. But this speed and scale needs to be enabled by all these different players that we mentioned, from industry to university to research. And a role of an accelerator MLC is tying all of these pieces together and helping build and foster an ecosystem for startups to thrive, and plugging in to to address their problem set at that specific time point, whether it be technical, commercial, support and fundraising, and recognizing that problem set changes over time, and then adapting the way that we work with them so that we can address different problem sets at different periods of time. So that's sort of what I see the role of an accelerator to be. And I often say, you know, we now have, not just on the food tech side, we have almost 200 portfolio companies. On the food side, closing to 30. Accelerator internally in-house, we're never going to be a subject matter expert on every single thing that each of our portfolio companies is doing. You know, I'd be lying if I told you we would be, but I'd rather see our role is to understand the macro landscape really well, the needs of the company really well, and then be able to plug in relevant subject matter experts within our extended network and that ecosystem we've built to really help support the startups.
Interesting. I'm not letting you go yet, Natalie. I have a follow-up with that. So I'm mainland Chinese, and then I also pay quite close attention on the China market, especially on the cellular agriculture side. So we hear a lot about on the consumer acceptance and then the government regulatory hurdles. Do you think they are impacting each other, or do you think it's more like, you know, you think these two aspects of things should be separated and discussed about?
I think they're always going to be linked. I think actually the regulatory approval process a lot will be driven by consumer demand and also by industry. I also think, you know, things like Singapore giving their first regulatory approval for cell-based meat to be commercialized is a really good signal for the Chinese government, where they're going to also look towards the framework built in other countries to inform their own. So I think on the consumer side, one good thing is, I think I read in a recent Ag Funder Bits and Bytes report where actually 70% of Chinese consumers are willing to try cultured meat. You and I know both being Chinese, I think the Chinese are actually among the top countries where people are willing to try new things, and they're so adventurous with their food. So there's definitely more and more corporate players also interested in the space. Merck, for instance, we've collaborated with Merck to run an accelerator specifically for cultured meat companies and to discuss how innovation can be fostered for Chinese companies. The regulatory front, I think right now, cultured meat is definitely in line with the country's priorities. There's this goal of being carbon neutral by 2030. And actually in the latest, the 14th Fifth Year Plan, they mention all protein as one of the priorities and national key projects, which includes cultured meats. So although there isn't a clear indication or regulatory framework as of yet, the government is likely to look at that of other countries, this is definitely a positive indicator to the market. And another thing regarding the regulatory framework is I think China also has very unique restrictions. GMOs, for instance, aren't allowed. There are also quite strict Chinese biosecurity laws, which have been recently again reinforced. There's no universally accepted definition of biosecurity across countries. Therefore, I think this gives also an advantage to local cultured meat players that are very quickly coming up and springing up. So I thought that answers your question. I think they're always going to be linked, and it's always going to be a bit of a push-pull.
Super interesting. And I think maybe I should direct the question to Dalal right now, because I think right now we are kind of seeing all eyes on Singapore because they are the first being able to give, you know, something that's, you know, tangible to people to try. And then listening to Nir and Natalie, I can see different countries, and also Tony, different countries really allocating different efforts based on their own cultural context and regulatory context to achieve their goal. So I kind of want to ask Dalal on, as you know, as you are based in Singapore, what do you think? Can you tell us a little bit of background of like what makes Singapore get to, you know, the place where they are, and then moving forward, what do you think, you know, the next strategic move from Singapore will be?
Yeah, absolutely. So Singapore, yeah, we're very lucky to be the first country to commercially launch cell-based meat. This was granted to Eat Just in December 2020. So this is quite new. I think something that has really been the catalyst for sort of the drive for novel food items and the regulatory approval to be quite fast is definitely food security. And we would say with the COVID-19 pandemic, this has really hit hard for many countries, but including countries like Singapore, which rely on 90% of their food, for imports. So they import 90% of their food. So it's very crucial for them to, find ways to become, food self-sufficient, to enhance food security. And this is something that they've been working on for quite some time. But I would say that definitely the COVID-19 pandemic was the catalyst to make things move faster than they already were. So in general, the ecosystem has already been built out. This is something that the government, including the Economic Development Board, Enterprise Singapore, as well as A-STAR, where they've really put their heads together to identify what kind of infrastructure is needed to develop, cell-based technologies or cell-based, cell-based meat. So, you have, of course, I guess a list of, local companies that have been growing, organically within the ecosystem. But of course, the challenges still remain on how they can, upscale, let's say, manufacture these products. And of course, to kind of, keep cross-checking in terms of the quality assurance and also the regulatory approvals, how this will come into play. So I would say that definitely this is something that's going to be moving quite quickly. You can see more and more companies, especially like one of our portfolio companies, Shiok Meats, that have just, let's say, announced late last year that they are establishing the first pilot plant for cell-based crustacean meat. So there is a lot of plans for, for companies to move towards the pilot scale and work as well with, let's say, local R&D institutions like A-STAR, as well as corporates that can support them in this space. But I would say that there are still many challenges, whether we like it or not. And it's not only the regulatory approval. I think there's a lot of unknowns in the sense of how we can, adequately upscale this technology. And we always forget about all the different bits and pieces, right? So there's biomaterials, there's bioreagents, there are the technological requirements for specific equipment that needs to be used. So who's going to supply, everything? And who's going to cross-check in terms of the quality assurance? And I think what we can see happening now is especially from our, let's say, limited partners and corporate partners, they're very interested in how they can pick up on some of these, let's say, challenges and how they can provide solutions when it comes to equipment by relying on some of their traditional technologies and then tweaking them and modifying them for the future. So, once we get to that stage, I think it will be very exciting to see that we can adequately produce. But we always say that Singapore will be a launch pad. For mass scale production, we will have to rely on, let's say, our partners in Northeast Asia. So relying on countries that have already well-established biotechnology and pharmaceutical capabilities. We'll definitely be looking at, China, South Korea, Japan, and seeing how they can also enhance and support this ecosystem. And I would always say that, because I'm always a skeptic. So even if we get past that, we have another issue, which is food fraud. So with all these different pieces, how are we going to still ensure quality assurance and safety? And what are some of the new food frauds that will come out of this, new industry?
Fascinating, thank you. And my next question is going to give it to Tony. So I really like what you said earlier. You said, is being a second or the third also have its advantage. And then since I think 2 years ago, when I started to get newsletters from Food Frontier, which, like you said, is one of our close affiliates with GFI, that I definitely see a spike in terms of the growth, the numbers of alternative protein startups. And you also mentioned Val, which is a cultivated meat company. So I kind of want to ask you, why do you think the reason, what do you think the reasons behind the increase of the startup number? Do you think based on your own culture and context, what do you think is the pusher behind the growth of alternative protein companies and especially cultivated meat-based companies in Australia?
Oh, thanks, Nydia. I think the thing is that, what we're seeing is, and it's happening all throughout the value chain, as soon as people see things becoming bigger, they see the opportunity getting larger, more people getting, they have more confidence. And we saw Memphis meats, or Upside as they are, and Upside Foods as they are now, into the market in the first place. And then I think GFI conferences have had a really big positive effect globally in bringing everyone together in one place at one time to realize that there is an ecosystem developing. And I think also, we look over these last few years, we've seen record amounts of investments from people like Brink and Big Idea into the space. So we're seeing also that money and technology are now global, and they can go anywhere in the world where there's an opportunity. You don't have to get Australian funding to get funding in Australia. You can get it from the guys at Brink, you can get it from the guys at Big Idea. We've have companies over here who have done incubators, accelerators with ProVeg in Germany. So it really is now a global ecosystem. And I think those front runners have come along. They've sort of raised things up into the spotlight. GFI has come along, brought everyone together. And I think that's really opened people's eyes to the opportunities that are around. And I think that's really the big drivers. And I think just, yeah, I mean, say the VCs as well, they look for opportunities. And if you're in a startup and you're saying, I want to start something up, I want to make a difference, who's going to have some money to support me? Well, there's money to be invested by some of these VCs.
Great, thank you. And I guess I have a follow-up question for you, Tony. I guess you say it's quite important to rely on a global support system for the cultivated meat companies in Australia. But as you know, if you are a Australia-based company, what do you think their advantage and disadvantage are, if there's any?
Look, Australia is a little remote from the major hubs that in the past, the US and Israel. We're seeing obviously a lot more startups in Singapore, China, Hong Kong. So we're getting that more local ecosystem. So being a bit sort of down the bottom there somewhere, or we like to turn the globe up the other way and say we're up the top, everybody else is down the bottom, but that's another story. So I think that is a little bit of a disadvantage, but less so. In some ways, COVID, I think, has almost made life easier because we do have conferences like this. People will Zoom with each other. They will Microsoft Teams. They're working together virtually no matter what. And I think one of the other advantages that we've had is we've seen more of the academic organizations, institutions come along as well. We now have universities throughout the country, major universities, who are now investing time and effort in their research in cellular agriculture and in cultivated meat in particular. And that's really giving us, it's reinforcing the ecosystem. And as we know, every time you get a major organization, whether it's a university or a supplier come in, your resources do a step jump like that. I mean, you get a major company. When we saw one of the ones I really liked was when Nutraco teamed up with Mosa Meats and Blue Nalu. Now, Nutraco, one of the biggest feed companies in the world for animal agriculture. And if anyone knows how to feed cells, it's those guys, right? So their R&D added on top of the R&D at Mosa and Blue Nalu really just propels the whole thing. And I think that's really important. And just even the support of having other companies in Australia is good as well. It just reinforces that it's a network of people. And besides, very proprietary information, I've found globally that people are very happy to share their experiences and what to do and what not to do. As long as you don't ask for anything proprietary, they've been very helpful and very open, because I think everybody realizes there's a huge pie. It's not win-lose. It's not if Mosa Meats wins, then Upside loses, or Vow wins and then Magic Valley loses. The size of the pie is really, really big and only growing as we see growing populations and middle classes. So there's a huge pie out there. And until it gets to the day where the pie is not getting any bigger, we might see a little bit more competitive interactions between the companies. At the moment, I think there's a really good global ecosystem. I think Australia benefits from that. We've benefited from seeing what other companies have done, what has and hasn't been successful. And we are still behind. We have nobody that's in the pilot scale plant. I think as Nia mentioned, you know, lots of companies are looking at pilot plant scale. I don't see us being in pilot plant till at least 2022, 23 at least. Because even to build a pilot plant, you're looking at 12 months. So even if we started tomorrow, it would be 22. So you're looking at 23 or more. But we do have a massive conventional meat industry in Australia, and we are about the top consumer of meat globally as well. We're right up there in the top 2 or 3. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it also means there's a great opportunity there in the marketplace. It's a big market. So I think there's pros and there's cons, but overall I'd say there's more pros than cons for Australia at the moment.
I love that answer. It's very great to hear that the Australia startup field is very friendly and also inclusive. And also I really admire for someone that's, they're basing one of the most heavy meat consumption, countries, and they're working to this really change the future for all the meat eaters in their region. So talking about partnership, I have a question for Nir. So we have been hearing news that Alal Farm announced partnership with big food players in Brazil or Japan. I think it would be super helpful if you can just briefly tell us what those partnership entails, and also tell us a little bit about why do you think it's so important for even earlier stage cultivated meat companies to establish a partnership along the way?
In a way, it's very simple. Israel, like Singapore, like other small hubs, is a very small market, and the cultivated meat companies want to change the way we produce meat worldwide. So we need to get access to the biggest markets. And what I love about those partnerships, especially with companies like JBS, is that we are partnering with the meat industry because they have the knowledge about what is meat, how to develop it, how to distribute it, how to get to the consumers, to the retailers, to the food service, etc. So it's really developing in a way that alternative protein and cultivated meat is not a competition to meat nowadays, but rather an alternative as it is to the consumer. So the companies are looking to partner with the existing infrastructure that the big meat companies have worldwide, not only meat, but other partners of the value chain, and to utilize their access to the market and technological knowledge, even sometimes like Tony mentioned, with regards to self-feed. I think it's a very important partnership. And nowadays we see, I think, every big meat, dairy, eggs company in the world is having an alternative protein strategy. It's fascinating to see companies like Tyson calling themselves a protein company, not a meat company any longer. It's fascinating to see companies like Nestle saying that the biggest growth engine nowadays is alternative proteins. So definitely a lot more to come in those partnerships, specifically for Israel, and I think also for Singapore, like Natalie mentioned, and Dalal. It's a necessity for small markets that want to go big, want to go global, and make a change worldwide.
And if you don't mind, if I could just add a little something there to what Nia's saying. As a futurist, I'm always looking for signals of change, things that say, things are happening that's saying things are moving in a certain direction. And one thing that kills startups, and I hope Natalie and will agree with me there, that is scale up. If you don't scale, the inability to scale, companies die. And to me, hooking up with large companies, whether they be companies already in the market or ingredients companies or people like that, once you see that hookup, to me, that's a real signal. Hey, this is going somewhere. This is not a whole bunch of startups that are going to fade and die away. When we start seeing all these hookups between, with Nutraco, and we start seeing, I think, Blue Nalu with Mitsubishi and Shock, we're just going like, okay, we've got the attention of big companies who bring again those massive resources to bear, because startups don't generally, They don't understand marketing. They don't have distribution channels. They don't have a sales force. They don't have all these things. And when they hook up with a big company that can help them with those, the multiplier effect is absolutely massive.
I totally agree. And I also want to ask Nir. So I really like what you just said, and then there is also, I think a lot of people might not know that there are two companies based in Israel that actually went public. One is a meat tech 3D, and the other is a biomilk. I also want to learn more about how did that happen, and it just sounds very different, from what we have seen elsewhere. And I want to understand a little bit more on, in Israel, and if you know any strategic thinking behind, those two companies being IPO, and how does that, really create an effect on consumers?
Now that we talk about the stock market, I have to tell that whatever I say is not a recommendation to buy the stocks or whatever. But yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's a combination of two big trends. One is that the Israeli financial market is very educated about the opportunity in alternative proteins. People know what they're talking about, the brokers, the investors, etc. And the public also wants to have a part of this global change that Israelis know we are a very big part of. That's one. Two, Israel in general sees itself as a startup nation. And so about a third of our GDP, a third, is derived from the high-tech sector in general. So the Israeli public markets are creating tools for companies to go public relatively early in terms of the burden of regulatory reporting to the market, to the public, etc., and also ways for the public to invest in startups in a very early stage. It's kind of like the SPAC in the US, but very, very early stage. So besides the two companies that went and did an IPO, we have maybe 10 more that the public can invest in directly using different utilities that the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange market offers to the public. So definitely very fascinating. And I think we will soon see those types of trends elsewhere. We have companies available to invest in the US, of course, in Canada, and other markets as well. But I think one more point, that the availability of cash to startups relatively early on in their lives calls for a possible change of startup growth strategy. If until nowadays we saw startups having to raise money relatively slowly, series by series, when they have to submit to certain milestones of development. Now, when a startup on the very early stage can have about $100 million in cash at the gateway, the whole growth strategy can change. And for instance, we saw MeatTech doing the world's first M&A in cultivated meat when they bought a European cultivated fat company. So an M&A strategy is open for startups that go public early, and it might ignite the phase of consolidation in alternative protein markets and cultivated meat. We see companies scattered around the world. We have maybe 100 cultivated meat companies nowadays. Eventually, we're going to see companies merge either to each other to create big companies like Beyond Meat that evolved from a startup and Impossible Meat as well. Or we were going to see them being bought by the big food companies like Nestle, Tyson, and others. So early days in the market, but because there is so much funding coming in, we're going to see some shifts in startup strategy, I think relatively soon.
Super interesting. I think a lot of startups right now must be paying very close attention to thinking what will be, the best strategy for their own company. Oh, I see. I just answered a okay to all the panelists. I think probably everybody can see it. That's Aman asked me to wrap it up and then moving to a Q&A. So I'm gonna do the exact same thing. So I guess, wow, there's a great list of questions. I think I'm gonna pick one for Dalal. One question is that what can other ecosystems learn from Singapore's success in becoming a food tech hub?
Yeah, great question. So I think definitely it has to be many things. I would say that it always starts from the government, to make sure that there are let's say, the right regulations and policies in place to let companies either establish their headquarters or a subsidiary. That would be like the foundation. And then making sure that there is sort of cross collaboration efforts between, academia, corporates, government stakeholders to ensure the company's adequate growth and development. I would say that whether we like it or not, it's also the region. So Singapore being in sort of Asia, which is now spearheading, let's say everything from all types of sectors, from consumer goods, as well as, growing food trends. I think this is, and also like a huge powerhouse when it comes to food manufacturing. When you look at countries like, Thailand, or even like, in China, and South Korea that are, let's say producing foods that are being exported all around the world. So I think, definitely the region, the location, as well as making sure that you have the right partnerships in place. And I would say, of course, funding, right? So like Singapore is also, a very established, finance hub where, capital can flow freely, as well as a place where investors feel confident to put their money into. So I would definitely say that it's a model that can be replicated, but there needs to be a very strong governance to really make sure that it's executed thoroughly.
Thank you. And well, I really wish we can stay longer, but I'm gonna give it the stage back to Aman, and I guess let him do the closing speech.